In this video, we're going to trace the timeline of space food from the 20th century all the way to today. So without further ado, let's get started. It all began in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite Sputnik 1. Then on April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin boarded the Vostok 1 spacecraft and orbited the Earth in 108 minutes. Humanity had taken its first steps into space exploration. In this environment full of unknowns, eating one of our most basic needs also had to be figured out through trial and error, redesigned from the ground up. While completing his orbit, Gagarin brought 2 servings of meat paste and 1 of chocolate sauce. They were both in a paste-like form, packed in containers that looked like toothpaste tubes. It's said that Gagarin ate them about 30 minutes into the mission, completing humanity's first ever attempt to eat a meal outside of Earth. 23 days later, American Alan Shepard piloted Freedom 7 into space, but because he failed to enter orbit, he was only in space for 15 minutes and 28 seconds. And for only a third of that time, was he actually weightless? So the achievement of being the first American to eat in space went to John Glenn. And that's where our story begins. According to the Kennedy Space Center's website, John Glenn, on February 20th, 1962, piloted the Friendship 7 spacecraft, successfully entering orbit and circling the Earth 3 times. The total mission time was nearly 5 hours. During the flight, NASA had prepared for him the first batch of American-made space food. First up, similar to what Gagarin had, was a nutritional space paste. It was squeezed out of a toothpaste tube to be eaten. It also had the same mushy texture as baby food, but unlike the Soviets' meat paste, the American recipe was mostly bananas. And since in the early days of American space exploration, astronauts had to wear their spacesuits and helmets the whole time before he could eat, John Glenn needed an extra adapter to be fitted onto the toothpaste tube. This was to make sure he could eat it safely. Besides the nutrient paste, NASA also prepared some compressed, dehydrated, and bite-sized food cubes for him. These cubes were made of things like grains and dried fruit, and their surfaces were coated with an edible film to ensure absolutely no crumbs were produced while eating. I think that for John Glenn at the time and Gagarin before him, eating these things felt more like a chore. After the initial space exploration of the Mercury program, American spaceflight entered the Gemini program era. This was a transitional program that lasted only a year, with the goal of preparing for the later Apollo moon landing. During this period, thanks to the experience of John, Glenn, and others eaten in space. When it came to missions that required longer stays in space, NASA thoughtfully prepared a much wider variety of food for the astronauts. The menu included vegetables, shrimp, and chicken, fruits like pears and strawberries, and even liquid foods like pineapple juice, orange juice, mushroom soup, and chicken soup. There was even a moderate amount of cocktails. During this time, the main technological advancement in space food was the use of freeze-drying technology. Freeze-drying is the common name for a technology called vacuum freeze-drying. This technique starts by placing food in a vacuum environment at -40 degrees. Then, as the temperature rises again, the water inside the food undergoes sublimation. This is how the moisture is removed. Food that has gone through freeze-drying has many advantages that are perfectly suited for space exploration. First, of course, is preservation. The shelf life is extended dramatically. Also, since the freeze-drying process removes almost all of the water, the food's weight drops significantly, which means it's easier to carry and transport. And finally, most freeze-dried foods can quickly return to their original state and even texture after adding water. Because of this, later spacecraft often had a special device, specifically for the step of adding water to freeze-dried food. Food that's been freeze-dried can retain most of its nutrients without destroying its original shape. As for liquid foods that weren't freeze-dried, they primarily used a heat stabilization technique with long-term sterilization to extend their shelf life. Also, there was a little incident that happened during the Gemini program. An astronaut once secretly brought a corned beef sandwich from Wolf's Deli, a restaurant near the base, up with him into space. It ended up being a pretty big deal. So big that the U.S. Space Agency, NASA, had to issue an apology. They promised that from then on they would conduct much stricter safety inspections on the astronauts. The Apollo program was the first mission to send humans to the moon. Getting from the Earth to the moon. That was undoubtedly a giant leap in human history. Space food naturally also made corresponding progress during this period. During the Apollo program's series of missions, the spacecraft were already capable of providing hot water for the astronauts. Of course, this meant the quality of space food saw a huge improvement. At the same time, the Apollo program's astronauts were also the first people in space to have utensils to eat with. Space food from this era was starting to look a lot like it does today. For astronauts, eating meant taking out a dehydrated food pouch, injecting water into it, and then waiting for it to rehydrate before tearing open the package and eating with a spoon. The variety of food also got way better, so much so that in 1968, the astronauts on the Christmas Eve lunar flyby even got to eat fruitcake. After finishing the lunar explorations, the United States from 1973 to 1979 carried out its space station program. Skylab was the result of their work during this period. This space station hosted 3 different crews, 9 astronauts in total, and the shortest mission had them living in space for 28 days. But for various reasons, Skylab was only in space for a little over 6 years before finally in '79, after it broke up most of its debris, crashed into the southern Indian Ocean and Australia, Skylab was the best of the so-called single-module space stations. Besides China's Tiangong, it was probably the most livable space station ever. It totally blows the later International Space Station out of the water. Skylab's best feature was that it was huge, so big that they had enough power and room to put a refrigerator in the space station. This meant all sorts of frozen foods, even ice cream, could appear on the astronauts' menu for the first time. And when it was time to eat, all the astronauts could gather around a single table. Each of them had their own dedicated and a massive food tray with several holes in it. These could be used to secure pre-made food. 3 of these holes even had a heating function. And there were 3 separate switches to control them individually. This way you could take frozen food straight from the fridge and heat it up right on the tray. The taste was in a completely different league from your standard freeze-dried stuff. This kind of luxurious tableware was exclusive to Skylab. The trays that came later were mostly just regular plastic trays with straps. Astronauts could strap them to their legs and use their own lap as a table. Also on one end of the plastic tray, there was a magnetic strip. You could use it to hold onto your metal utensils. After meals on Skylab, astronauts could use the vast interior space to get some exercise. That's something later space stations didn't have. Also irradiated food, during this period, started appearing on the astronauts' menu. This is a technique that sterilizes food by exposing it to ionizing radiation. It's a technology used to sterilize food. Although this could better preserve the food's original form, it still sounds a bit unsettling, doesn't it? Anyway, no matter how the relevant authorities vouched for its safety, there were still many people who found it hard to accept. After Skylab, the Soviet Union's Mir space station, and the International Space Station led by the US and Russia, and built with the participation of 16 countries, became humanity's outposts for space exploration. During this period, due to the involvement of more countries, the quality of food on the space station, compared to the Skylab era, actually declined a bit, because of the limited space and the need for the equipment to be used for more experimental projects from various countries. So even though the International Space Station has added cooking appliances like microwaves, their dining area has actually gotten more cramped. Plus, the focus of life in space has been designed more and more around the big picture of recycling and reusability. And the most prominent example of this, of course, is water recycling. Water plays an absolutely crucial role in an astronaut's diet. Astronauts don't just drink water straight. They also have to use it to heat up food, restore its texture, and mix all sorts of powdered drinks. Apparently, in an urban environment, the average person uses about 350 liters a day. That kind of consumption is just unimaginable in the enclosed space station. That's because the station can only get a very limited amount of water from resupply missions. When it's transported up, it's packed in a sealed bag and then fed directly into the space station's water purification system. This system recycles and reuses 93% of the water generated on the station. And I know you, the audience, are already dying to know, do they recycle urine? You bet they do. Forget just urine and wastewater from washing. They even recycle your sweat. And don't get grossed out. That's the power of technology. It's just a necessary part of living away from Earth long term. Of course, even in the 21st century, with all its advanced technology, some foods are still off limits in space. For example, things that create a lot of crumbs like bread and crackers have never been able to make it onto the astronauts' menu. But the people in charge, they also found the closest possible substitutes for these items. For example, using tortillas instead of bread and waffles instead of crackers. Actually, it wasn't just the food. All kinds of seasonings like salt and sugar were also banned from space because of their granular form. So if you needed salt, you'd spread salt water on your food. If you needed pepper, you'd rub some pepper sauce on it. In this regard, Americans really showed how meticulous they are. NASA has extremely strict requirements, even for the packaging of space food. For example, even a snack like M&Ms, which can be stored anywhere and needs absolutely no reprocessing, has to be removed from its original packaging and be repackaged separately. That's because Americans believe that any material going into a spacecraft, no matter how small, must meet a whole host of specific parameters. This means that even the ink on the packaging needs to be tested separately. So to avoid all that trouble, they just strip the original packaging and wrap it up again for you, and that takes care of that. On the other hand, the Russians are much more laid back about this stuff. They just bring a bunch of canned food you can buy at any supermarket. And it's because of this devil-may-care attitude that their cosmonauts often pull off some crazy stunts, like secretly sneaking alcohol into space. We've been talking a lot about spacecraft from other countries, so of course we have to talk about our own Tiangong. Compared to the International Space Station, which was cobbled together by multiple countries over nearly 20 years, Tiangong's biggest advantage is its standardized and unified structure. This kind of holistically, centrally planned design is definitely a huge plus for utilizing the space-dot model. It's just about to be completed and put into service. We'll just have to wait and see. As the saying goes, a time will come to ride the wind and brave the waves, to hoist the sails and cross the vast sea. Go China Aerospace. Go, go, go.